No, I
right there.
have that in, yeah, that's in the big book.
I know that a lot of condominiums don't allow,
Let's see if I can get another
and
copy.
there are some HOAs that don't allow RVs, so it's like, you know, as soon as you have an RV, it's like, well, I better figure out
Yep. that's
paying
it.
for a monthly parking space somewhere.
Yeah, well, you know, I figured that out real quick when I moved to Phoenix. You know,
Yeah.
the first thing I do is go out and find a nice place to rent for the RV.
Yeah,
Yeah, probably.
You can't put it on the street, you can't put it on the side. You know.
Yeah.
and I don't know what those spaces cost,
So I can.
but you know, there was one time years ago, and my wife and I have never been big on RVs, we've never owned one. But somehow or other, we got this invitation to go up to.
I'd like to abstain
Cottonwood
from that,
or someplace
actually.
up there, or Sedona. and it
I'd like
was-
to abstain from
It was
that.
with this group that had Travel America, and basically it was campsites set up for RVs. And you know, you become a member, and you go to one RV place and stay there for a week or so, and then maybe next year you want to travel out to some other place, and you have RV places to stop.
It's
while
the
we're
second
away.
time you've come back with me. I was at another meeting today.
We're
Yeah,
up
probably
there,
your
and
pen.
You bet, help yourself.
like I said, we don't have an RV. And exactly, I said, Christ, the cost of buying the RV, then having to equip it. I said, "Well, we just
I have all these pens
you
in
wanna
my
go
truck.
somewhere?"
If you need one, I bet he could
Yeah,
scrounge
drive
up one
down
if you
and
want
get
one.
Well, I'm
on
not
the
sure I'm
plane,
needing tonight, though.
visit,
Here, I
looks
have
pretty
it.
fly back,
Oh,
rather
well,
than
thank you.
having the RV. What was the name of it?
Put in for elk today.
He
Should
said
make
they,
that minutes.
What unit?
you know, I said, well,
Eight,
they said you
nine,
get a
7, 8,
gift,
9.
and I said, so favorite. Well, if it's a approved meeting, I said, I got probably 6. Very interesting.
Yep, 7, 8, 9.
They come out-
I gotta do the same thing,
No,
get
no,
mine
no,
in.
no, it's Jerome had breakfast.
Did he put in for what?
Elk hunting?
But, you
Oh,
know,
elk
we
hunting.
got there
Okay.
early, so I thought, well, I'll go and get a couple.
And that's one I like,
Oh, we're having a staff meeting.
lottery
Come in.
places,
Okay,
isn't
so
it? Okay.
Stand outside.
We
waiting.
never get drawn for anything,
Yes.
ever.
One
So
heavy
I
set guy
figure
with-
we'll just keep putting in.
Tan trousers.
Why not?
Maybe.
Red shirt.
Usually
He
during
comes out,
a
starts
period that we
talking
won't
to us,
be.
and all this, and
That's how it
everyone
works.
was- Staff meeting, run out there, going running around the parking lot.
We're
picking up
hopeful.
Cigarette butts, and I looked at one guy, I said, Christ, I haven't seen him since I was in the service, and this guy's explaining. how
Wow.
Most people really have a pride of ownership when they're a member, but they
Yeah.
have to pick up the public areas.
We'll see.
I mean, I had an uncle, that's what he did for years when he retired.
If you elect not to
He and
select
his wife got a
where,
small RV,
then
and they map out a trip, it would take about 11 months, and they go see,
But-
make a circuit of the country. And see
So
different things.
if he didn't want to go one year, did he
I
give it to
guess they
somebody
get
or
back
raffle
to
it
upstate
off?
New York, put the RV in for maybe
No.
for a month,
I think
and
they can turn it.
stay with the family for a month,
Yeah.
because they had
Turn
a
it
they
back,
had fourplex. and
There's
normal
sometimes you
ones,
can,
so they would
you can,
stay in the RV
don't,
unit for a month.
sometimes you can pass it on to a
For
young
years, they loved it.
family member, depending on the
I
circumstances.
tried that for a while. It gets tiresome.
But mostly it just belongs to you and that's it.
my son's in for his first
But I've been
time, so
retired for
hopefully
so
he gets
goddamn
drawn.
long, I've had time to do almost anything.
Yeah.
Are we about ready? Actually, I guess we got 2 minutes according to the computer. It's a big crowd tonight.
I know it's a little overwhelming at times, but I know we can handle it.
I was just gonna say, this is the most peaceful part of my day right now, these couple of minutes. Unlike some other meetings.
I guess the public comment portion will be fairly short, looks to me like. All righty, shall we ready?
Okay.
I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission, date February 2nd, 2016. Like to have a pledge of allegiance. Claude, would you please lead us? Okay, roll call.
Annie Lane,
Present.
Michael Bacon,
Present.
Gary Passia,
Present.
Claude Baker,
Present?
Julie Van Wolfen,
Present.
and Charles Merritt.
Present.
Lawrence Mullen is absent.
Okay, would have any discussion about the minutes? Any questions? I would entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the January 5th, 2016 regular session.
I move.
I second.
Have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Motion carried. Okay, I'm going to make a change in the agenda to take care of some housekeeping. I'd like to move item 8A up into position as the next item on the agenda to take care of electing a new chairperson and a vice chairperson. So, James?
I'd like to jump in there. Thank you, Commission. Can you hear me, Claude?
Now I
Yes.
can.
Okay, good. All right. We will actually only be electing a vice chairperson this evening. The Unified Development Ordinance was amended in April of 2015 to automatically place the vice chair into the chair's position. And then we only elect for a new vice chairperson among the members. So I wanted to clarify that for the agenda item, and if you have any more questions on procedure, please let me know.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, seeing as how I was the vice chair, I guess that makes me the new chairperson. I would like to entertain some nominations for the vice chair.
I don't have my slip with me indicating who has served the longest on the commission, and I would think Gary or Claude has.
I believe Gary has served the longest after myself, and then I think Florence, but she normally would not want to be part of the leadership.
Okay. And I would think those who have served the community the longest on the planning commission may wish to have the honor of serving as the vice chairman. So I would like to, and if Gary is the longest of the two, I would like to nominate Gary for the position of vice chairman.
Okay, does anybody else want to nominate somebody?
Excuse me, wait, was it Gary or Claude? I made sure I got...
Gary.
Gary,
Yeah.
okay.
I just want to interject a comment. I'd like to abstain from this vote. I don't feel that I've been serving on planning and zoning long enough sufficiently to comment or make a recommendation.
Okay, so we have an abstention.
And I think myself as well. I don't feel like I've been here since it's my first meeting long enough to know who to nominate.
Well, hopefully nobody else abstains, we'll be in trouble. Is there any discussion?
I would just like to say, I'm new on the commission as well, but I'm not sure how I could actually vote on a particular manner, as my associate said, but I'm thinking for the honor of serving, it's probably the best for the one who, maybe not the best, but those who have served on the commission the longest and who know the community and have worked with our citizens here.
I don't have any objection to that criteria. I will say that when I first started serving on the board, there was some decisions that had to be made that I didn't really feel up to, but did anyways because there wasn't anybody else any more experienced or whatever, so.
So I'm not trying to say that Claude isn't the most experienced or the best to serve. I really don't have any basis. If I abstain, I'm not quite sure we'll have enough to vote in a new vice chairman. So I'm not sure, he hopefully doesn't take it personally. I'm doing the best I can up here.
I don't see any issue. Claude, would you have any issue with the criteria, seeing as how you're the third longest member up here?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Do you have any
I'm not hearing you
objection,
tonight.
do you have any objection to Gary being nominated based on his length in service?
No, I do not.
Okay. So we have a nomination. Do we have a second? Actually, we should probably do a motion and then a second. I would entertain a motion to make Gary the vice chair.
Mr. Chairman, I would so move to nominate Gary as the vice chairman.
Do I have a second?
Second.
Okay, any discussion?
Does
All those
Gary
in-
want it?
I don't think he's got a lot of choice.
Does
If
he
he abstains,
want
we're
to be
going to
vice
Say I
chair?
accept.
All right, let's get this vote over.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Anybody opposed? And then there's 2 abstentions. All right, Gary, you're it.
Congratulations to you
One of
both.
these days, you'll get to have some fun up here, huh?
Okay, we'll move on to the next item,
Okay.
which is our staff reports. This evening will be our first round of looking at these. With all UDO amendments, we're required to bring them for citizen review, which is what we're doing this evening. It's a non-voting meeting as far as these go. And then next month at our meeting, we'll be looking at the same amendments again. You'll see the same presentation again. If you have any questions for me this evening, I'll address those questions in the next presentation. As far as what we're putting forward, they're just some housekeeping measures for the way we handle business here in town, and looking at what we really want out of our Unified Development Ordinance, and what we've been working with in the past. So these are just some measures to get things in order. And I'll begin with that note. I'm actually going to skip to the parking section because that's first in our agenda. So why are we amending the UDO? It is a living document. It needs to be looked at every so often, and we look at it every single day in working with customers at the counter or having meetings with potential developers, that kind of thing. And we notice things in the ordinance that sometimes don't make sense. And at the time when they were adopted, they could have made a lot of sense, but in this day and age, they just don't seem to make a lot of sense. So we're looking at that kind of thing and trying to take care of some housekeeping measures. And as we work with it on a day-to-day basis, we understand the kind of outcomes that it gives us. For example, we'll be looking at some parking amendments, which are pretty, in our sense, common sense. But in the past, we've been working with these parking regulations that require quite a lot out of property developers and property managers, and don't tend to take into consideration how business is done. So we'll be looking at those pretty closely, and what we want to do is align it with the outcomes we'd actually like to see in town. So as we go forward, we look at our general plan, we look at the types of projects that are being proposed based on meeting all of the criteria of the Unified Development Ordinance, or UDO, and we say, is that actually the project we want? It's the project we require, but is it what we want? So we just kind of like to take a look at these things, and we'll be continuing to do so. So these will be before you on occasion. The proposed amendments are all listed here in a table format. The first one is the citizen review process. We'll be making changes or looking to make changes to the requirements for neighborhood meetings, putting some of the impetus on the applicant. Currently, there's a lot of hand-holding done by staff, which is fine, but we'd like to see some of the applicants come forward with a little bit more work on their part and a little bit of trust from the town. So the other ones are all parking ordinance amendments. Our first one will be looking at joint use parking for PADs. PADs are planned area developments. We'd like to extend some of those rights to developers who are outside of a planned area development. Currently, they have a specific set of rights that other landowners do not, and we'd like to look at that. We also want to look at removing some contradictory requirements for maximum parking. We have two requirements for maximum parking, one of which says 20% more than minimum, and one of which says 10% or 40% more than minimum. And we have no idea which one to enforce currently. They are a little bit confusing, so we're looking at removing some contradictions there. Next, we'll be looking at the table that has parking requirements based on use and getting rid of some RV parking requirements in apartment and condo complexes. I'll begin with the parking language, and at any time you have questions, please jump in and ask them. I feel it'll probably be easier to address them as we go instead of addressing them all at the end, if that's okay with you. Currently, the language in UDO section 4.22.5, part E, allows joint use parking for PADs. As I said, PADs are planned area development. If you want me to expand on that, I can. If an applicant for a mixed-use PAD can demonstrate through a parking study supplied by the applicant and approved by the Development Services Director or his or her designee, that the peak parking demand for mixed uses will be less than the sum of parking spaces required for each use served, then a reduction in spaces may be allowed. That is to say, for example, if we had a breakfast restaurant and a bar and grill in the same building, and we were going to require, for example, 10 spaces for the breakfast restaurant and 10 spaces for the bar and grill, and the breakfast restaurant was only open from 5 a.m. to noon, and the bar and grill was only open from 6 till midnight, for example. They're doubling up the amount of parking that we would require, and it doesn't really make sense to supply too much parking for those uses if they can demonstrate to us that they will have enough parking on site. And that's done through a parking study that's typically done by a third-party consultant. It would be submitted to us showing that each use is different and has a different peak hour. Typically, parking requirements are based on Black Friday. So we base our parking requirements for Walmart on their busiest day of the year, for example, and we end up with a mass sea of parking in front of each shopping center, which isn't always a desirable outcome. This is one way that we look at, especially for smaller developers, to cut some of that cost burden of placing 20 parking spaces on their small strip mall development, for example. And it also cuts back on some of the land use requirements. The parking typically takes up anywhere from a third to 2/3 of somebody's land when we get into these larger uses. So we're trying to look at a more common sense way of supplying parking spaces for mixed uses. This is the proposed amendment. We'll basically just take the language for joint use parking for PADs and change it to joint use parking and remove a mixed use PAD from the first sentence and change the language from mixed use to joint use, just to be more consistent with the rest of the part. Do you have any questions on that amendment specifically?
Only concern I would have is if the usage of the building changed and there wasn't adequate parking. Is there some provision for that?
Yes, currently there's a provision for any time that a developer decides to, or a property owner decides to change a use or intensity of use, or even hours of operation, we can come back and revisit that joint use parking agreement. The joint use parking agreement is required to be on hand in development services. So we can go to the joint use parking agreement and say, these are the hours that you said you would be operating. You're extending, and now we're having a parking issue. We need to go back and require more. And currently, the UDO allows for that.
I can't see why a business owner would not be excited about being able to share parking. I mean, parking is always a problem. So.
It's always a problem, and we have several meetings a week where they're begging us to reduce their parking requirements. We see a lot of cost coming from that. For example, in Portland, Oregon, they just went to a 0 parking requirement in their downtown core, and apartment complexes said, we love that idea. They tried it, and they said, nobody wants to live here without a parking space. So what they did was they said, let the market dictate that, and the apartment complexes put in as many parking spaces as they felt they required, and that's actually how they've been operating for about the past 6 months. So we are looking at what other jurisdictions are doing and trying to be a little more flexible with our developers. We know a lot of the developers who come in are strapped for cash, and we require a lot of improvement from them, especially in Chino Valley. We have a water and a sewer system that doesn't serve all of our commercial areas, and we often ask them for those off-site improvements to be done up front. And one of the ways we can reduce the cost burden on them is through looking at stuff like this.
Okay, I'm all for reducing the expenses to
Okay.
folks that are trying to make a buck on the business.
So am I.
I would like to offer the comment that I've worked personally with these parking agreements, joint parking agreements, my last position, and we had, over my 15 years, I think I was the only person who actually wrote the 3, and they worked. I can remember one was between a church and another business, like an accountant or whatever, and of course the church is only in operation a Sunday and maybe a Wednesday night, and the parking lot is empty. However, I noticed that the code is lacking in one respect, is that we need to inform both property owners that this is a binding agreement. What we did is that we wrote up the agreement, had both parties sign it, with the understanding this restricts their property rights in the future. For instance, sometimes a church will want to go to a daycare, and that means, well, if it's with another office use, they start a daycare facility, and if it's a large one, you're going to have traffic. There won't be enough parking. And so what the church can do, unless this is recorded and it is tied to the property, is that the church could say, you can't park here anymore. The business is now short of parking. They're parking on the street. You receive complaints, but there is no written formal agreement to bind the property owners. And I think perhaps something like that should be put in the code to indicate that, yes, this is going to bind you if you want to sell the property in the future or if your proposed uses change.
I can see how that would be a concern. The way we currently handle them is that they are given to us from property owners. We don't write them for the property owners, and we require a signature of both parties. So it's not in our code, but that is the way we operate. It's written by the property owners and signed by both parties.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to emphasize that because the city or the town will be caught in the middle for lack of enforcement, or because when it spills out into, was it residential adjoining parking, other commercial lots, the city or town will be getting the complaints. And so I want to make sure it's tied down that each party knows their obligations.
I can definitely see where that would be a concern, and we address it through our process. It's just not codified currently.
Okay.
So I appreciate you bringing that up.
I'd like to commend staff for going forward on this, too.
Oh,
I
thank
think
you
it's
very
a great
much.
idea.
Thank you. I'll move on to our next amendment in parking. These are the provisions I was talking about that have different or differing requirements for maximum parking. The first section is 4.22.8b. The maximum number of parking spaces provided shall not exceed the minimum number of spaces and an additional 20% of parking spaces, except as otherwise provided in this ordinance. And here's where it's otherwise provided in the ordinance, Section H. Alternate design standards. To provide flexibility in design and development of projects, alternative design standards are provided. The total number of parking spaces may be increased by 10% above the maximum. However, in no case may the total number of parking spaces be increased by more than 40% above the base maximum allowed. So, in reading this with our attorney, our engineer, and our development services director, we all came up with different answers as to the maximum number allowed. That was with people who are supposed to be professionals at this, and as a private party looks at our codes and wonders, how many parking spaces am I really allowed? It's difficult to determine that from this. What we're proposing is striking out all of that language and leaving it without any maximum. And here's the reason why. A maximum limit set on the number of spaces each development may have typically is not reached. As I said, we tend to have meetings where developers beg for a reduction in parking requirements rather than begging us to have, 40% more than the minimum. Our current provisions conflict with each other, as you saw, and removing both would allow for a little bit of clarity, as well as an approach that allows the market to dictate the amount of parking, rather than us saying, here's the maximum you can ever do. In thinking about this, I thought, where's a case where we would run into the maximum? And I thought a business owner wants to provide 7 spaces for his small development, but the minimum required is 5 under our current code. And if they wanted to do that, she would not be, well, we don't actually know if she would be allowed to do so. And the way we've handled this in the past is we, at the discretion of the zoning administrator, which is the development services director, have signed off on things that were unclear and may have been, more than 20% of 20% over the minimum. And we've been sort of forced to deal with this in a gray area. And what we'd like to do is clarify that there really isn't a maximum, and if somebody comes forward with a design proposal that has a sea of parking, we will probably recommend that they don't do that in technical review. They come through a feasibility meeting with us and a technical review meeting with us, and we discuss the merits of the project. If somebody is proposing 200 parking spaces where 100 is the minimum, we're going to say that's not the highest and best use of your property, and we would highly recommend you come back with a different plan. This does leave us open to the possibility of somebody proposing 200 parking spaces, but I don't see that happening. If we need to come up with a different maximum language, we certainly discuss that.
Well, it seems to me that a developer is not going to add additional expense to his project without a driving need for it, so having a maximum number of parking spaces limited doesn't really make a lot of sense.
That's how we felt about it, and that's why these proposals have come forward like they have. So, is there any more discussion on that item?
The only concern I had would be the business changes. The coffee shop goes out of business and a daycare or some other high-traffic use goes in. The property's already developed now. The building's already in place. The parking lot's already in place. They need more spaces, but there's no more land. And so I see that, and I base that on experience I had working for hospitals. There's never a hospital on this planet that's not under construction
Oh, yeah.
and remodel.
Yeah.
And they develop and they develop, and they need more employees, and pretty soon now they have no parking.
Well, this would not have a maximum, so they could continue to develop parking, and I can see where they would run out of space if they were continuing to develop. But as each proposal came through the Development Services Department for a remodel or a tenant improvement, we always look at the change of occupancy. So if the occupancy load goes up, our parking requirement goes up. So they would never end up in a situation where they're expanding beyond us requiring more parking.
Okay, I'm new at this, so maybe
Okay.
I'm asking a silly
Sure.
question, and feel free to tell me if I am. If they've run out of land space on their property,
Yes.
and they want to now go up a story,
Hmm.
for instance, where do they put this additional parking? And I know you can reconfigure and slant the spaces a little more at an angle and a lot of these things.
We would be required to deny that application.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. Any further discussion on that item?
I think we're good.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the next one. And we can vote on each of these individually, but the items that we put forward, I believe, were all of the parking together and the citizen review process as a separate item. So
Okay.
I believe that's how we'll end up having
Yep.
to vote for them. Okay, we'll look at the parking table last. I put these all on one slide because it was a little bit easier to represent in table format that way. Currently, we require one parking space, one RV parking space per 10 apartment units on any apartment complex greater than 5 units. So what that translates to is a parking complex with 40 units would end up with 4 RV parking spaces. And the same is true of condominium complexes in our code. What we'd like to do is remove that requirement, mostly because we think the intent of the ordinance was something that looks like this, and we think what we'll end up with is something more like this. We don't really want to see RVs sitting in apartment complexes, primarily because the property managers probably don't want to see that either. These are the kind of ways that it's a burden to a property manager to have an RV on site, and we talked to some apartment property managers, and they currently actually have one on Butterfield Road, where an RV is parked there, and it's parked there long term. And what is the issue is a apartment complex manager may say, sure, you're allowed to have an RV on site for 30 days. I should say it's probably more like 3 days. So your buddy comes to town, he needs to park his RV somewhere. The apartment manager may be extremely generous and say, of course, you can park it here. And then the friend loses his job, decides to just stay living in a parking lot in Chino Valley in an apartment complex, and there is no provision in the Landlord-Tenant Act that would allow for a removal of the RV from the premise based on a time frame. And then they would end up having to monitor the RV, make sure there's no crime happening out of it. And on top of all of that, it's an additional upfront expenditure. They're paving the actual spots, which are generally 30 to 40 feet in length and up to 15 feet wide. For context, a typical parking space is 9 by 20, so it's almost double the size. And they also have to widen all of the inside turning radii on site in order to accommodate the travel of the RV. And they also have to widen the travel lanes to accommodate RVs. So it makes the parking lot bigger, and that all adds to additional expense up front. And over the long term of maintaining that parking lot. We also checked around town, and there are plenty of RV parking and long-term storage businesses in town. And I did a price check on several of them. The average is about $39 to $49 a month, which, if you're an RV owner, is probably less than the gas that you're going to pay for a week. So it's a pretty good deal, and we can't really see it as a good deal for the for the apartment complex manager. Those were the ones that we were looking at in the parking code. Are there any questions on the RV issue?
I do have a question on
Sure.
the table.
Okay.
If you can go over the table 4.22.8.
Yes.
Because I'm not seeing how RV and how regular parking requirements filter into this table.
So this is just our regular parking requirements table. If we look at the 4th line down, all apartment complexes with 5 or more units shall also provide guest parking and recreational vehicle parking. So the way it's currently written, it's pretty unclear, but if you look down at the condominium ones, it's 1 recreational vehicle space for each 10 units. In our current UDO, our table is actually cut in half by a page break, so we actually kind of extrapolated what was in there to make it fit on one page. So
The reason I'm asking is because I'm looking at the table that's presented before me now. For instance, 2+ bedroom units, you need 2 regular parking spaces per dwelling unit.
that's correct.
Okay, so if I go down to all apartment complexes, and I'm a developer coming to town, and I want to add 10 units.
Sure.
Okay, so basically, I only have to provide 11 parking spaces for 10 units, because it says 1 additional space per 10 dwelling units.
Oh, I see. What we need to do with this table is not cross out the guest section of that. So what we require is 1 additional guest
Okay.
parking space per additional 10 units.
The point being made is that it's not clear. The condominiums, it's very clear. It says 2 parking spaces per unit plus 1 additional space per 10 dwelling units. And when you're looking at the multi-residential and apartments, I guess you're supposed to automatically say, okay, if it's a 2-bedroom plus it's 2 spaces, and if I have 10 of those, then I have to add 1 space. It's kind of,
It's a
not
little
really clear
unclear.
what this 1 additional space per 10 dwelling units is.
Okay. I think what we probably need to do is put 1 additional guest space per
Right.
10 dwelling units.
So that ties the 2 lines together, put guest back on the left side, and then
Mhm.
put guest in on the right side.
Okay, we can do that for the
Tie
next
it to
round.
the guest
That
back.
makes sense.
Have a
Table.
good eye on that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for catching that. What we don't want is a 20-space complex with 10 or 11 units, or 11 parking spots. That would be bad.
For the
So
people that live there.
1 additional guest space per 10 dwelling units, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then make sure that both sides are tied together with the word guests, so we know clearly what it is.
That makes sense. Okay. I've got those written down, and at the next meeting, we'll get those in there.
Okay.
Okay. If there are no further questions on that, I'll head back to our citizen review process. I'm going to give a little bit more explanation than what's up here. Currently, our citizen review process follows state statute and requires a neighborhood meeting. That's done 15 days prior to the planning and zoning meeting. So once they reach you, they're already about 30 days into the process. They've advertised for the meeting. They've sent mail to all neighbors within 300 feet of the boundary of their property, and they've posted the property. And they've said, I'm having a neighborhood meeting on this date and time, and at this location. Then they have a 15-day period, and they come to Planning and Zoning Commission, and we have the public hearing, and then it moves on to Town Council. That's currently what we do. The proposed change that we'd like to make has nothing to do with the time frame or the posting or publishing or mailing of letters. What it has to do with is how staff and the applicant interact during this meeting. So we will continue to follow state statute, of course, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that we are not intending to skirt state law with this. So I just wanted to get that out there. If you have any questions about the process, we can look further into it for you. Our current language addresses neighborhood meetings in this way. Excuse me, my throat is dry. Okay. The zoning administrator, upon consultation with the applicant, shall establish a time, date, and place for the neighborhood meeting that provides a reasonable opportunity for the applicant, adjacent landowners, and those other potentially affected citizens to discuss and express their respective views concerning the application and any issues or concerns that they may have with the zoning or change of zoning and use permit proposed by the applicant or by the application. The zoning administrator or his or her designee shall attend the meeting, but is not required to conduct the meeting. The zoning administrator or his or her designee shall report the results of the neighborhood meeting to the commission and town council at such time as they take action on the application. The proposed language reads something like this. The applicant, upon consultation with the zoning administrator, shall establish a time, date, and place for the neighborhood meeting that provides a reasonable opportunity for the applicant to inform adjacent landowners and other potentially affected citizens of the substance of the proposed action, and adjacent landowners and other potentially affected citizens will be provided an opportunity to express any issues or concerns that they may have with the proposed zoning or zone change, or zoning or change of zoning or use permit proposed by the application before the public hearing. The citizen review meeting shall be held not less than 5 days prior to the public hearing on the application. The zoning administrator or his or her designee may attend the meeting, but is not required to conduct the meeting. The applicant or his or her designee shall submit a written report of the outcomes of the meeting to the zoning administrator, who shall include them in the reports to the commission and town council at such time as they take action on the application. So that's a mouthful. What we're saying is we would like the applicant to consult with us on the time, date, and place they'd like to have the meeting instead of us consulting with the applicant. That puts the impetus on them to come up with a time, date, and place that works for them and that they submit to us and we either approve of or disapprove of. That would allow them to have a little more flexibility. Currently, we don't dictate it, but we tell them what is the best time, what is the best date, and what is the best place, because we are required to attend those meetings. Furthermore, we are asking the applicant to submit a report of the meeting, written, that would include the time, date, place, the attendees, their contact information, and all of this will be put in the zoning application packet. That won't be outlined in our zoning code. That isn't quite necessary to get into that level of detail. We'll put it all in our packet and require it as part of the application packet. Let's see. The other thing that we're asking of the applicant is that they have it at least 5 days before the planning and zoning hearing. Currently, we ask them for 30 days, and there's no requirement in state statute that says that it needs to be 30 days away. It says it needs to be 5, so we're just aligning this with state statute. And we ask for 30 days because it gives the neighbors time to do that, and we'll continue to ask for that, but say the requirement is 5, we would appreciate 30. We don't want to make it more difficult than the state intends. So here's some of the effects of that language. The applicant must host the neighborhood meeting and report the results of the meeting to the zoning administrator. The zoning administrator is no longer required to attend the neighborhood meetings, and the reason we don't think the zoning administrator should always be required to do this is we believe that it limits the free and open discussion of the proposed project with the applicant. The applicant may be unsure of what they're allowed to say in front of the town, and if they can have a open and honest dialogue with the neighbors and the other potentially affected landowners, then they can have that discussion and maybe come up with a better solution than if we were there watching over their meeting. And the other thing that we noticed was we often are required to have the meeting at this location out of necessity. It's difficult to schedule a location, especially at 6 p.m., and especially with short notice, like two or less weeks. So we end up with a perception that the town is supporting this project, whether or not that's actually the case. This has been seen in the past, and it ends up with the perception that we are leading the meeting. We're saying, hey, look at what this applicant is doing. This is what the town wants. And whether that's the case or not, that's often the perception. And what we'd like to get away from is the rumor mill that's often started around town that says, oh, did you hear the town is proposing a new fill in the blank, medical marijuana farm, whatever it may be. And that's one of the things we're trying to avoid with this. Are there any questions?
I have one. Are you saying that the town hall would not be available for these area meetings, neighborhood meetings?
We're not saying that it would not be available, but we always, and this is what we do now, we always encourage them to do it on site or in a neutral location. That way, if it's on site, they can take the people who attend the meeting around the property and say, this is where I intend to put the restaurant, or this is where I intend to put whatever it may be. So we encourage that. It gives them an opportunity to actually show their intent. And we're not saying it would be unavailable, but that's typically we try to avoid that.
The reason I'm asking is that on controversial meetings, you have people working during the day.
Absolutely.
So if you take them on site, that means you're going to cross out a lot of people, and it have to be a weekend meeting. And so that means, well, can they come on a weekend? And people have plans on the weekend. And if it's in the evening, it's like, well, the public library's closed at 6 o'clock. And so, and if they're not a member of faith, where do they have the meeting at? And so I'm just looking at the opportunities, so the closed opportunities that might be occurring here.
We would definitely still open our doors to them, and if we anticipate a project being controversial, we plan on attending that meeting anyway.
Okay.
We would sit in the back and say, we're hosting this meeting, but we are not putting the meeting on. We're just offering a public forum.
Now, is the staff going to provide the applicant with the mailing labels of the people who need to be notified, or does the applicant do that?
They currently do that themselves.
Is that
This
for
won't
all
change that
applications?
process. Yes.
So does staff review these applications? I mean, the mailing list to make sure that the proper radius has been notified?
We actually give them the list.
Okay.
We don't give them labels.
Okay,
Yes, we give them the list, and we currently require an affidavit of mailing.
I see.
Yes,
Okay.
we give them a lot of leeway in that, and for the most part, we have trustworthy applicants. When we get the feeling that they're not, we can ask them for certified mail, so that we know exactly who was sent what on what date.
Okay.
Yep. Go ahead, Annie.
I have a question, and both of you touched on it a little bit. I like the idea of this. I'm just wondering where the accountability comes into factor. Like, say, hey, I want to open a backyard bar, and I send everything out to my neighbors, and they all come to the meeting, and they say, hey, Annie, don't do that. We don't like it.
Mhm.
And I submit my report saying, everyone thinks it's a great idea.
There is a level of trust that we're placing in our applicants by proposing this. As I said, if it's something controversial, we'll be there anyway. So a backyard bar definitely wouldn't be. I know that was an example
I think it's a
on
great
purpose,
idea.
but we would be there. One thing that we had considered was asking for an affidavit stating that their report to us is true. The other thing that we were considering was if there's a bad idea and it's proposed, and they're probably not going to lie to us because their neighbors will probably be calling us as well. On all of the letters that we require they send out, we require that they put our phone number and my email address, and the same is true for the property posting. We also put a publication in the Daily Courier 2 weeks in advance that has my phone number and email address on it. So there are a lot of ways for neighbors to get a hold of us, and they will. We've had that with every application, even if it's not very controversial. They get a hold of you. They want to know what's going on around them, and that's a good thing. So we definitely have considered the affidavit idea. Yeah.
I would like to see the affidavit method somehow worked out for the
Okay.
accountability of the accuracy of what was spoken at the meetings. I'm all for citizens being held accountable. I mean, that's one thing that, that's what we fought hard for all these years, was for us to have our own voice. And we don't need to have the city government or any other government mixing into our business if we can handle it ourselves. So I like that idea of having the opportunity for you not to be there. If you choose to be there, that's good. But in order to cover fairly what was said at the meeting, there needs to be some accountability, and so some sort of a document that reports what was said there, and then somebody being held accountable for signing off on it would be a good idea.
Okay. And that might be something that might not be implemented in our code, but might be implemented through a packet. I'll have to look into how we would do that best. But what I can do at the next meeting is have an example affidavit drawn up, and we can show you what one might look like, and I can tell you how we would end up implementing that, whether it be through the UDO or through our packet that we hand out. Another idea that just kind of came to mind while we were talking about this is maybe we give them an example report that says this is what a report should look like to us, and maybe an example sign-in sheet that we could put in there.
Yeah, we would want to, on those meetings, they would have to have a sign-in sheet, who was there, who spoke, what was said, that sort of thing.
Yep. And that's something that we'd like to see in the report. A lot of times at these uncontroversial meetings, nobody shows up. What we've currently been asking, and this is just one of those things, it's not a requirement, we're asking them to do it. The meetings are generally held at 6 o'clock in order to accommodate people getting home from work in Prescott and that kind of thing. If nobody shows up at 6, we ask them to stay till 6:30, just to give people the opportunity to get there in case they're late for whatever reason. And often, no one shows up at all. So, in that case, we would just ask them to submit a report
I
stating
can't
that.
imagine having a meeting and nobody showing up.
I know, especially with important things like this.
I'd just like to comment to the commissioners here, is that in working with the city of Prescott, we always had these neighborhood and area meetings. And being new here to Chino Valley, living here for 2 years, and being a more rural area than Prescott, of course, we really didn't have these issues of perception. But we made it very clear right from the get-go is that staff was there as an observer only to take the notes of the meeting, to convey them to the commission and our staff reports, and that the applicant, right from the get-go, we made clear to the audience that the applicant was in charge of the meeting, and staff was only there to provide answers to questions asked by the audience regarding the code. So I don't have any problem in voting for this particular ordinance change because it's Chino Valley is a more rural area, and there's different reception of people here as to what's happening in government, in their local government. But this is just all kind of new to me in terms of how it's being handled just from 15 miles down the road. So I'm just trying to educate on how Prescott does it, that's all.
Sure. Thank you for that input. That's really helpful. One of the things I want to assure you is I promise we'll use our professional judgment, and if we need to be there, we'll be there. That's something that we strive to do. We want to be involved in these projects, but occasionally there isn't a strong need for that. So
I do have a question again.
definitely.
And more for my education probably than y'all need, but
Okay.
is it possible for you to show us the packet or the parts of the packet that are affected by this proposed change
I'd be happy to.
so
yeah.
that we see what the applicant sees?
I'd be happy to bring it in next
Okay,
time. Yep.
and that
I'll
maybe we can satisfy our need for accountability by looking at that.
definitely, yeah. It's a pretty large packet that we require of folks, so I'll bring one in, and I'll also send one out to everybody.
Okay, yeah,
so
I
that you
probably
can
don't need
at
to
it
look
in
at the whole
advance.
thing, but
Yeah.
the parts that we're talking about.
Definitely, yeah.
Okay.
And I'll just show you what we have now, and then I'll show you a couple of new forms that we could make
Okay.
up. Yeah.
Could you put the excuse me, could you put the proposed wording back up on the screen, please?
I'd be happy to.
Would it be possible to say it in the last paragraph there, a written report on forms provided by the commission, so that we control what they're going to say, who they're going to say, the sign-in sheet and everything else would be as we request rather than something on the back of an envelope.
I think that would be possible, but given the nature of those meetings, sometimes I think it's better to allow them to give us a written report in the style that they wish to. Some of those meetings can last for 5 minutes, some can last for several hours. If we try to limit it to a form, we may end up with some difficulty in getting the full picture. That's my one worry on that item. We could give them an example and ask for something that meets the quality of that example.
That probably would be the more proper way to give them freedom for their expression, but give them examples of what you're expecting to see so they've got a target to shoot at. That's a good idea.
Claude brought up a good idea, and that is a sign-up sheet. That's what we normally had in our meetings. Are you going to ask for it to see a sign-up sheet to be submitted?
We definitely will, yeah,
Okay.
and we'll ask for that as part of the
All right.
report. Yep.
I might be being a dead horse here, but in regards to the accountability, if they were to need an affidavit, if the discussion feels that's necessary, I would personally like to see it included in the changed wording of the UDO so that they know looking into it that this is what is required instead of after the fact.
Okay, I'll look into whether that can be done. Thank you.
I have another question.
Yes.
And probably after this, I'll not say anything.
Okay. Don't limit
but-
yourself.
okay.
That's what we're here for.
If you were talking about having an applicant that you feel may give you the feeling that they need closer inspection, and you're asking them for an affidavit, but you didn't ask Joe Chino Valley for an affidavit because you've done business with him before and you're familiar with it, is that somehow discriminatory or singling out somebody
I think what we
that
would
could
do,
get us in trouble?
I think what we would do in the case that if we do end up with an affidavit as part of the requirements, we'll ask it of everybody. We apply the process equally to everybody.
Okay.
That's our policy. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, but if they know up front what's expected, then there's no surprises.
And typically, what we do in these cases is have a sit-down meeting with them prior to the application and explain each and every item and why it's required. Any further questions?
So far, so good.
Okay. I misspoke earlier when I said we would be voting on these. We won't be voting on these tonight. They're just up here for our discussion. At our next meeting, we will have the opportunity to vote on them and send them to council. I will bring back the proposed changes, and we'll look at them then. We had another item on our agenda. Let me pull that up. Is this it?
Oh, the sign regulations?
Yeah. This is again a non-action or a non-public hearing. I'm sorry, it's a discussion item. So we'll only be discussing, no voting. I want to kind of give you guys a heads up. We'll probably be putting it on the March 1st agenda that will begin a kickoff of looking at our sign ordinance and making amendments to it. That won't be a voting meeting again. What I intend to do is make it over the course of several meetings. It's a lot of information to ingest, and I don't want to be here till 9, just being honest. So what we'll do is do several presentations. Typically, what we do is ask for a lot of citizen input on these, and the way that we're handling it is as we get calls in about signage, I ask if I can put them on a mailing list, and what I'd like to do is get a lot of citizen input on this, especially from the business owners. We started this process just before I came on, I believe.
Yeah, it was last year.
I think it was in June of
Yep.
last year, and that stopped because a Supreme Court decision came down from a case in Gilbert, and that forced every town and city to look at their sign code and make sure that it was non-discriminatory. So what we'll be looking at is making sure it's non-discriminatory against uses, and then also trying to make it a little bit more business-friendly. So those will be coming up, and it'll probably be a little bit of a long-term project. So just be prepared. Yeah. If there's any discussion on that, what direction we'd like to take, it is a discussion item. So.
Well, I think spreading it out a little bit is going to be helpful, just judging by the first batch of work that we did with it. It's extremely complicated.
It's very complicated and a lot of information
And
intake.
there's a lot of passion with the business folks about
bet.
the sign, so.
Okay.
I think anything that makes it easier on the business owners with the signage that we can work towards is a good thing. That's one of the main concerns that I hear from citizens and business owners.
Great.
Do you, is there some, in layman's terms, explanation of the Supreme Court ruling that we should be doing homework with, or?
I'll include it in your packet.
Okay.
I'm not a land use attorney or a sign attorney, so there's my disclaimer. But my understanding of the case was Gilbert had a sign code that allowed for temporary signage. It was very restrictive in some cases, I believe, with special events. I believe they were allowed 7 hours prior to the event, and they must be taken down 7 hours after the event. But then other types of temporary signage were allowed long term. The person who brought it to, or the group that brought it to the Supreme Court, I believe, was a church. They set up at different locations all over town, and they were having a really difficult time complying with the sign code because it was so restrictive. So they sued on the basis that it was discriminatory language in the ordinance, and they won at Supreme Court. So that's making every jurisdiction look at how they handle signs like that. And this is going on in a lot of the jurisdictions around here. Prescott, I believe, just had a vote on it. So we're looking at getting our code in step with that decision, in addition to the other changes.
Now, does that cover the political signs that go up and?
It does
all
cover
that?
political signs, yeah. And it's been a difficult balancing act after that decision for a lot of communities. So it's actually a good thing that we ended up putting the brakes on it, because it gives us a little time to evaluate what we have and evaluate the decisions that other jurisdictions are making.
Okay, so I'm going to move to the public hearing part of the meeting if there's
Fantastic.
nothing else. And so the public has an opportunity to speak. And seeing no public here, they've made their voices clear. So we'll close the public hearing part of the meeting. And is there any other discussion items that we want to talk about besides the sign ordinance? Anybody have anything that they'd like to discuss? Alrighty, then I would entertain a motion. One thing I would like to say is, this is the first meeting that Gwen Rowich hasn't been involved in for quite a long time. We want to honor her service here. She was a great member on this board, a good chairman, and gave all of us a big safety net when it came to dealing with a lot of this stuff. So I just wanted to bring up the fact that we're going to miss her on the board, and to welcome our new member.
Thank you.
I think she'll definitely be missed. And,
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll move.
Second?
I'll second it.
All righty, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting's closed.
Opposed?